Before we get started, I want to maybe set a very brief context, and then I want our expert speakers here to like take over from me. So I want to do the least amount of effort, to be very honest, on this panel today. The idea is we're going to have like maybe 1 to 2 rounds of questions, and I want to open it up to our audience here to ask any questions you may want to ask our experts here. So I think we want this to be as interactive and collaborative a discussion as possible. So to get us started, I mean, we all know that the Middle East and North Africa region has, and it's a long-standing concern, but more so now, has been facing issues, the twin challenges, like they call it, of food insecurity and water scarcity. And this has only been more pronounced and accentuated by the current challenges that we face around the world, which is geopolitics, the supply chain disruptions that we see, climate change, and of course, rising pressure because of increasing populations. So given the social, geopolitical, economic transformations that we see around the world, water and food are under direct stress today. And it's important to have this conversation more so in this part of the world because water, again, given the climate that we're in, given climate change is far more disproportionately damaging to countries which are part of, the West Asia, it's important to have these conversations so we can adapt and we can create more resilience, infrastructure, and ecosystems to be able to adapt to this. On water specifically, I mean, we know that, given the arid climate, given more minimal renewable freshwater resources, and a rapidly increasing demand from urbanization, agriculture, industry, countries in this part of the world, whether it's UAE, Saudi, Qatar, they all have relied on energy-intensive desalination projects to be able to meet their water needs. But today, these systems are under stress, they're under duress because of naturally climate change, but also energy market volatility. The UAE in particular is an interesting case because it has taken a lot of leadership in both these fronts, right? About 90% of the food imported into the country, we have a national target in the UAE to cut that down to 50% from 90%. So the UAE really wants to be more self-sufficient in its food production. When it comes to water, they're hosting, along with Senegal, the UN Water Conference next year. The idea is they want to be able to have an important and be able to reshape the conversations around water diplomacy. So I think the fact that UAE is really leading these discussions, it's, I think, a very timely moment to be able to have this conversation on what the UAE is doing and what other countries in the Gulf can perhaps also do to be able to support water and food security. So my opening question to the panel is, and maybe if we can take about 2 to 3 minutes each to answer that, is that how can countries in the MENA region overcome and adapt water and food security challenges? What can the governments do, but also what can the private sector do to be able to address some of these concerns? And we have a very interesting mix of a panel because we have 2 academic and policy experts, but we also have 2 industry practitioners who can then bring in a very nuanced perspective. So I can't wait. So maybe we'll start with you, Wahid.
First things first, thank you very much for hosting us today, RSDI as well as ORF Middle East. My name is Wahid. I'm a partner at an organization called Amali Legacy, and we develop nature-based solutions. To answer your question, if you look at the problem of food security as well as its nexus with water scarcity in our part of the world, it's critical to look at the root causes, right? There are 2 parts to this equation. One is we need more production. Second, we need to reduce waste. And reducing waste, our colleague here can share more on that. But increasing production, we view regenerative farming as a very viable pathway to get there, right? Regenerative farming is a set of farming practices that improve soil health over a period of time. It includes practices like cover cropping, crop rotation, intercropping, agroforestry, reduced synthetic inputs, composting, among others. Now, if you implement regenerative farming, it supports improving soil health and by extension improve the quality of the crops and increases production, right? And the beautiful thing about this approach is if you improve the quality of the soil, it enhances the soil moisture levels by 30%. So that means you require less water for the farms themselves, right? And that's the nexus to water scarcity. Now, a beautiful mechanism that is coming into this is the carbon markets. There are standard-setting bodies such as Verra today that define regenerative farming very clearly. And with that definition, in the context of regenerative farming, you have a methodology called VM0042. It precisely captures what these practices are, how are they to be implemented, the protocols to be followed, and when you follow them, you can generate carbon credits. These are instruments that can be sold in commercial markets today, both voluntary and compliance markets. And the money that you receive from the sale of these carbon credits can, again, trickle down to the smallholder farmers or the large-scale farming project that is implementing this. And that reinforces this virtuous cycle and supports food security and addresses water scarcity as well.
Incredible. Wahid, so I think you've highlighted two very important things: the importance of regenerative agriculture to support both food insecurity and water scarcity, but also very importantly, the role of finance in carbon markets. I think if we can, one of the bigger challenges is a lack of capital in being able to support a lot of these efforts. And I think the mechanism, if utilized well, can really support these efforts. So I'd like to now move to Dr. Samara. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the invite, and thank you all for being here today. So, Faten Samara, I'm a faculty of environmental sciences. I'm a chemist, environmental chemist. So a lot of what I might speak today, it's a little bit of a different perspective. And as an educator, one of the main challenges that I have found it is that whenever I ask my students, do you think that UAE it's a water scarce country? Of course, they will not think so because they are so used to having accessibility to it all the time. And I don't think they look at the behind. And the same thing with food. As you mentioned, 90% of the food here is imported. So I think during crises like COVID, for example, nobody felt that there was a lack of any of these important supplies. So I believe that awareness is a very important challenge that we are facing. Going from the normal person all the way up, we need to establish awareness and we need to communicate on what the challenges are. We're not going to save or conserve water if people are not aware that we need to be conserving, that we have resources that are scarce. And I believe that that is one of the main targets that we need to go into. Now, looking into food, we need to also consider the idea of the quality of the food. It's not only about the quantity. Different farming techniques, as you mentioned, are really important, but we need to also understand what the challenges are. I believe it was in 2009 or so, or a little bit later, that the UAE had to ban the import of certain produce coming from different countries because of the high level of pesticides. So we also need to understand what goes into our food, what are we consuming, and also link that health aspect. And then, of course, look for techniques for water. Wastewater reuse, for example, it is now implemented in many countries. If we look at the example of Singapore, they are having a success because they are able to reuse the water. They are wastewater reuse. Of course, that also comes with challenges because we need to change the mentalities and the perspectives of the population of what water you're using. But the UAE has been very successful in desalination, right? We're being able to do so. But if a challenge like the red tide happens, like in 2009, then what are we going to do? So we need to look into other options to complement what we have. In the case, as you said, we have a lot of challenges. So we need to start learning of what others are doing, learning from our own challenges. And I think that we also need to be very localized, so that regional support, because the challenges we have here are not the same challenges that everybody has. And that's also very important.
Thank you. I couldn't agree anymore. I think in the policy-making world, we often try to sort of replicate, solutions in one part of the world to the other without indigenizing and contextualizing them. So I think that's a point well made. And also, thank you for highlighting the importance of quality and not just the quantity of food, which is equally important. And I'll double click on that in the second round. But over to you, Professor Asaf.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Actually, I come from both an engineering background and a policy. I do teach in water resources, climate change, sustainability issues. But I think the issue here, we talk about here, United Arab Emirates, but also the MENA region, there is a dilemma here. The dilemma is this region is very water scarce. In fact, if you ask me as an engineer, is it worth it to grow, for example, wheat or rice here? I would say no. You're better off doing it somewhere else. But then the issue about food security, people think of it as you have to produce the food here. So there is a dilemma here. And one aspect to it, which is probably controversial, is to somehow decouple food security from water security. In addition, there is another element, which is energy. So when we talk about water resources, let's talk about the MENA region, because I think one of the issues, the MENA region is quite different from one place to another. In the GCC countries, agriculture was not very predominant. It mostly was water scarce for a long time. If you go to countries like Syria, Jordan, Egypt, agriculture is not only a way to produce food, but it is a very important economic sector. So when we deal with it, if I zoom in here back to United Arab Emirates, since we are here, is that if I were to think about it, food security has multi-dimensions to it. So when you look at it, you don't want to think about producing everything here. You need to have a certain percentage, as you mentioned, maybe 50%, but then you need to look at other aspects. Importing is not necessarily a bad idea as long as you diversify to make sure you actually get your food from different places. You need to develop your storage, strategic storage of food, and also food waste, which is a very important aspect. So there are different ways of dealing with food security rather than just thinking about growing food, using water to grow food. Now, in water aspect, as an engineer, water resources person, one of the ways to deal with water scarcity is to move it from one sector to another. I'll give you an example. If you are in a place, let's say in Jordan or here, you rather use it for urban users rather than, let's say, agriculture. Because agriculture in this region wastes about 90% of the water. If you do, for example, if you produce wheat in France, you rely only on, as you said, the soil moisture, which is the green water. You don't need to irrigate much. If you're going to do wheat here, you're going to waste a lot of water for, on irrigation. So you're better off actually to buy that from our side, store it, and focus on what you call high value crops, as we do here. For example, we look at these vertical farms, growing herbs, growing things which are high value. That makes a lot of sense. So you need to think not necessarily in one lens. And the other thing we talk about, desalination, we need to be careful about this. Desalination is very expensive and environmentally also has a lot of harm. So if desalination is necessary because we need it for urban users, but I will not advocate using it for agriculture. It just basically, it's a huge amount of energy. So I rather use treated wastewater as one aspect. This is another aspect that's happening these days. So we need to think out of the box and think in terms of different things. Technical solutions are good, but demand management is very important. So I leave this for later for other speakers to.
Thank you. I think there's a lot that we want to double click on, but over to you, Salman. Two of our speakers have spoken about food waste, so we'll let you take that.
So I come from a more corporate and consumer background, so my perspectives will be very different from the experts here in the panel. But one thing which we've realized is food security and water security is a massive problem in the region. And that's because of the nature of the region, right? There is a lot of water scarcity and we look at the problem slightly differently. I think a lot of the times consumers, businesses, corporates and governments sort of overlook the efficiency in which the resources are being used, right? Whether we talk about water or whether we talk about food, sadly, this region has this nature of excess, right? We always have everything in oversupply. When we talk about food security on one end, we talk about water security on one end, but you see enough water flowing everywhere, you see enough food being thrown out everywhere, and nobody's actually taking notice of that, right? So, and that all is somewhere interlinked, and like doctor said that, we need to decouple it and think of it as separate problems, but all these problems sort of somewhere add on to each other, right? If you are not rightfully redistributing or utilizing the food that's already present in the ecosystem or present in the region today, then you are adding stress to the water system inherently, right? And on one hand, you can use a lot of tech to optimize the rightful efficient usage of the water to produce the right amount of crops and do demand planning and all of that. But then I think we need to also put a lot of focus on the rightful redistribution of food, because this region is the largest waster of food per capita by miles. We are not close to anyone else. Just a sad truth that I tell everyone when I meet them is Europe and the US, which is known for consumer economy and the mass amounts of wastage, do about 160 to 170 kgs of food waste per capita, and UAE itself is 200 plus, and Saudi is a lot higher, right? And that's not higher by small numbers, it's higher by a magnitude of 2 almost. And this all inherently puts a lot of stress on the food ecosystem, on the water ecosystem, and so there are policymakers and researchers talking about the problem and identifying solutions for the problem. There's the government which is utilizing that data to build policy to drive it. But I think at the very last mile, the people who actually need to implement solutions are the corporates and the consumers, being more conscious with their daily decisions in order to actually bring about a change and the behavioral shift in the mindset towards a better tomorrow, right? So yeah, I think that's my 2 cents.
Great. I mean, thank you for being the practical, and also giving certain a challenge to our other speakers here in some sense. But I think it's been quite eye-opening in ways that the fact that the UAE has per capita food wastage is almost twice as much as other countries in the West. Maybe we'll talk about solutions on that, but I want to come to you, Wahid. Given your background in investments and finance, and Salman also spoke about the role of public-private partnerships here. Can you talk us through a little more? How can finance be leveraged, and how can we deploy capital more effectively towards water and climate solutions? Is that even happening? What is the state of play when we think of broader private finance? Are there investments in climate, agri-tech, water-related solutions? And what more can be done to leverage capital more effectively to have that kind of an impact on these regional challenges that we see?
Excellent question. So at Amali, one of the things that we do, we engage with different types of funders through our podcast and through different convenings, just to understand what is their criteria to deploy capital. We're talking about largely private capital, but we also engage in dialogue with a lot of multilaterals as well to understand what is their objective, how they deploy, what are the metrics that they look at, because ultimately you're engaging with individuals that have a job, that they have a mandate. For me to deploy this capital, I need to have a ticket size that is above 10 million or 20 million euros, for example. I need it to be in the specific geography. I need it to be within the following thematic areas. I need it to be highly de-risked and a bankable investment case for me to put my money in. Because ultimately, for every transaction, they will need to bring in their subject matter experts and their in-house team to do due diligence, and that costs money. So you literally have a team that is getting paid a salary to invest anywhere from 3 to 9 months doing deep due diligence on a particular project before they get the green light from the investment committee to deploy that capital. And we know for a fact, based on the data that is out there, there is abundant of dry powder today at a lot of private equity funds, which means there are funds today that have capital, they can't deploy it. That's their problem. It's a nice problem to have, having a lot of money and not knowing how to deploy it. Now, we do see more allocations being made to food security, to climate specifically. But the biggest challenge right now, the bottleneck for these flows of capital to come in, is having projects that are investment ready. This takes time. It takes a lot of resources. A lot of project developers have a hard time with that because it takes anywhere from 3 to 4 years to structure these projects and make them investment ready, so that when you go through due diligence, you actually pass and the investment committee can approve those funding to go through. So I think what is currently missing is catalytic philanthropic funding, technical assistant funding, which is available, but it's very scarce, right? You literally get an email every 6 months or 9 months highlighting that, yes, we do have this specific opportunity. These are the timelines for technical facility or for catalytic funding. We also saw what happened with USAID. After it got dismantled, there is even less catalytic funding available right now for a lot of the project developers that are creating these large-scale projects, right? So I think there is a very large amount of private capital today. Banks are very happy to offer sustainable finance and debt instruments to support these projects, but there is a gap on the philanthropic, catalytic, risk capital to de-risk a lot of these project opportunities.
Got it. And also, I think, like you very rightly said, there is capital. There is a lot of capital out there that exists, but the pipeline of projects is missing. So there is a demand-supply mismatch in some sense as well, right? And can you also highlight the role of sovereign wealth funds here? Because this part of the world has one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world today, and they're really leading the charge in certain sustainable investments. So your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. What we're starting to notice in this part of the world, as well as more towards the east as well in countries like Singapore, for example, sovereign wealth funds are taking a very active position on some of these thematic areas that we mentioned. Carbon, we do see it as an enabler to food security because when it comes to projects like regenerative agriculture, having the carbon element in it as well reinforces that virtuous cycle. And we are starting to see sovereign wealth funds such as Mubadala, for example, having active stakes in the carbon market. We are starting to see Temasek, for example, taking active stake in a lot of these segments within the carbon market. But more specifically on the food side, we do have regional champions here. We have IHC, we have Alafra, we have ADQ, Silal. These are all regional, local champions that are truly reshaping food security and being a great example for other countries to follow suit as well. So in terms of how the UAE is pioneering that, it is truly phenomenal. It is truly fascinating. And it's an exciting time to witness how these sovereign wealth funds and state-led entities are making investment in this space.
Great. Coming to you, Dr. Samara, someone who is working on environmental science and human health interface, could you speak to the less visible impacts of water insecurity, right? Particularly on public health, water quality, the resilience of ecosystems in these regions, the impact on indigenous communities. So can you talk us through the social aspect of the challenge here?
So a lot of the work that I do as a researcher, it is that I do look at pollution in a lot of these ecosystems. And one, as you said, one of those silent parts, it is that people don't realize that a lot of the activities that we have, that increase in population activities, the fast growth and development here in the UAE does put a lot of pressure in our aquatic ecosystems. And of course, that puts pressure on the fisheries as well, on the food that we consume. So data is becoming one of the biggest challenges because that is not currently that available. So if we understand the challenges of pollutants, I mean, we look at microplastics, but not many people really look into these microplastics in the water that we're consuming. Are the techniques that we're using adding more of these microplastics? Looking into metals, for example, heavy metals. And I think that the UAE does a really good job when it comes to removing some of these pollutants, but obviously as any part in the world, there are some pollutants that are there. And that creates this huge challenge as well when it comes to public health. So with climate change and the region being so vulnerable to climate change, a lot of these pollutants are going to become even more challenging. So currently a lot of the work that we do, we've been looking at fish, for example, and then understanding the fish populations, because of course, as part of food security, fisheries are a big challenge. The UAE used to be a large fishing industry, and then that slowly has slowed down. And now we're going into fish farming, but that also presents other challenges. So I think, as was mentioned, we need to really understand the idea of how can we make that connection. Air quality is another big challenge. And of course, air quality also affects water quality, which will affect the food that we consume. And when we look at particulate matter in this region, we're particularly in a region where we receive dust from a lot of different parts surrounding us. And then, of course, all of that will end up in our water, will end up in our food. We are a large port. We transport a lot. And all of this, again, it sort of comes out. So I think we need to really understand the idea of how the ecosystem is not just individual, or they are not separated, but everything will connect to each other. So if we are able to look at that baseline data, I think when we talk about investments, we're not only talking about investments on big projects, but we need to also invest on the smaller scale research, right? Understanding what are the main challenges, what are pollutants that are affecting us, what are the sources of those pollutants. And that is one sector that I would like to see more investment in, that I would like to see more of that research being funded and more interest given towards it. Because what is the point of us finding new sources of water or finding sources of food and improving the security if then we're consuming water and food that it is polluted and that is going to affect the health? So I think that we need to really make that connection between all of them.
I think that you make an excellent point on being able to regionally cooperate more on data, I think in the region, like Professor said, that there is so much diversity within the MENA and within the Gulf itself that we need to be able to collect data to be able to make more evidence-based, informed decisions on this. But could you highlight, Professor, a few examples as well or case studies in your research experience of what worked and what didn't work?
So, I mean, one of the main challenges that I find here in the UAE is that, of course, we have different emirates, and all of the emirates will have their own specific governments. And again, we need to think of it as a cooperative effort and not individualized effort. So whatever I do in Sharjah, most likely it's the same challenge that will exist in Ras Al Khaimah, right? So I think we need to have more of that coordination and collaboration. And that's something that is growing more. If you look at the UAE now in particular, there is more encouragement for collaborations amongst different institutions, amongst different entities. I mean, with the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, we had the Climate Change Research Network, and that was the main idea of that was to try and link scientists within the different emirates to work together. And that doesn't only stop here. We have to expand it into the region because, again, we have challenges that are shared. When we look at the IPCC reports, we see a lot for a lot of different places, but we don't really see a lot that just focuses on our region. And that's something that should be expanded. So I think that's something that needs to be more thought.
Got it. Professor, I'll come to you now. I think you made some very interesting points about that we can't grow everything in-house. We have to learn to, in a globalized world, engage with other countries. So diversifying our sources could possibly be one solution. You also spoke about the diversity within the MENA region, within the GCC countries, and to be able to acknowledge that to come up with more thought out policies. You spoke about how different industry applications need to be contextualized in the sense that, desalinated water could perhaps be better suited for one purpose or one industry versus, using treated water in agriculture could be a better solution. So can you walk us through a couple of solutions that exist and some that have worked and that haven't worked? But also, can you give us examples from other parts of the world, say in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, where a lot of these other developing countries also facing very similar acute challenges of water and food security? What are they doing and what are they pioneering? What are the cross exchange and learnings that what can the UAE and Gulf teach them about some of these solutions, and what can we adapt and learn from them as well? So if you could talk us through it from a very technical perspective and engineering lens, that would be very insightful.
So when I look at the MENA region, I don't look at it as one thing. As I mentioned, there are different. For example, agricultural development, as I said, in countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and so on, is different from here. 98% of the people here are actually urban, so they are not involved directly in agriculture. Whereas if we go to Egypt, Syria, a large sector, so it's not just a matter of growing food, but it's a very important economic sector. So you deal with the situation differently. I'll give you an example. In Egypt, there is resistance to do the water demand management to some extent. The reason is because a lot of people are involved in farming. So one thing you need to do is how you retrain them to go to other sectors. In general, most farmers are poor, actually. And go to rural areas, they're not as well served. So there is a movement towards urban areas. So it's already happening. The way I look at things is that water is not, as many people think, is very important to life. It is important to life. But the amount you require to drink is very tiny, drinking water. Most of it is going to washing, agriculture, and many other things. So we need to use it as such. Desalination is a very expensive thing. It's important. It's necessary for this region. But I would use it only for, let's say, things which require very high quality water. When you talk about agriculture, you look at treated wastewater. Now, treated wastewater is a big issue in the region. Since you talk about example, let's say take Tunisia, for example. What they did, farmers don't like to use treated wastewater. They like fresh water. One of the reasons is when they sell their crops, they don't want to say, oh, I use treated wastewater. So it's not a good thing to set for as a business. So what the government did, they put a differential pricing for treated wastewater and fresh water. So you get treated wastewater much lower in price than the fresh water. So that really shipped them. And also at the same time, tell them this is not a bad thing to do. See, from a technical point of view, treated wastewater has advantages and disadvantages, to be clear. Advantages, actually, it has nutrients in it. Disadvantages, has some salinity in it. Okay. Another thing is contamination. In this region, we use what we call tertiary level treatment. There are different levels of treatment. There's primary, secondary, tertiary, and there's a fourth level. Tertiary meaning the water, you can't touch it. You cannot contaminate you. Secondary could do contamination. So you need to do some kind of educational thing for farmers and for people to know that this water is not necessarily bad. Okay, as long as you have to treat it well. So treated wastewater is a very good source, especially in this region. Huge amount of coming. It has another advantage. It is available throughout the year. You don't have to worry about it. It's there. Second, now one of the issues is infrastructure to bring the water. So now there's a lot of emphasis in the United Arab Emirates, and in fact, in many countries, to develop the infrastructure to take treated wastewater to places where they can use. So treated wastewater is certainly really a win-win situation. Now, the other aspect is what we call where we use the water. I advocate myself, many people don't agree with that, to use the water for urban users. And the reason is because that's where is the highest value of the water. Now comes the food security issue, which people tell you, okay, if we don't grow our own food, we are insecure. That's not necessarily true. You could be growing your food and also have insecurity at the same time. What you need to do is to look at it as a multi-dimensional thing. There's about maybe 7 different or 8 different ways to deal with food security. To start with, not only importing, of course, growing your own food, some of it, diversify where you import it, storage, strategic storage, demand management, and also what they call the farming outside, going to other countries, which is some people consider to be controversial, but I believe if you, let's say, when you go to countries like in Africa, if you're going to have farms there, you need to actually develop the infrastructure. You need to see the benefit, the farmers there. So they trust you that you invest there, they will benefit, you will benefit. That's another example. So there are ways to deal with food security independent of the water aspect. The water aspect is a huge one because what's happening with the climate change, as we talk about climate change, I want to mention, because I do deal with the research on climate change. This region, I'm talking about the whole MENA region, is going to be hotter to levels that's unbelievable. In the Gulf countries, it's going to reach sometimes over 50, and it's going to be very hot. So it's going to be hard to walk outside. Another aspect is what they call the drying happening, meaning it's not related directly to the warming. It is actually a different way of moving moisture across the world. So North Africa is already experiencing, and Eastern Mediterranean is already experiencing droughts. And that's related to climate change. So those countries is going to be impacted, and it's going to impact other countries. So water is going to be less. Another aspect to the water, not only people grow in numbers, but there's another aspect. They grow in consumption per capita. The more wealthy you are, the more you use water. So therefore, per capita increase. So we need to look at the water aspect by itself too. Another, I did mention it earlier, the nexus between the water and energy. Energy is very important to water. Why? Not only for desalination, but also for other aspects, treating the treated water, also using water for energy production. So there is this linkage. So the examples in many countries now, if you look at another country like Jordan, and I did work on it many years ago. I one time mentioned that there is what happened accidentally, actually, that they contaminated the reservoir in one of the dams by mistake. Treated wastewater, raw sewage, went into the dam, and it was a disaster. But in fact, it was a discovery. What they did, they moved the water to the Dead Sea area. So the farmers are using that water. At the same time, the fresh water is pumped to the higher land. So now they have that system where fresh water is used by urban users, treated wastewater is used by farmers. That's a good way of an example, for the region. I don't want to take. I want to leave more questions, but there is in the United Arab Emirates there are many initiatives happening. One thing about ICBA, I don't know if you know about ICBA. It's called the International Biosaline They actually try to develop crops that can tolerate salinity, that can tolerate droughts. That's very important. You can grow crops which has great values, requires little water, can tolerate salinity. Salinity is an issue here in this region. Salinity of the soil. So you need to look at that aspect. I'll stop here because otherwise I teach. That's why I keep talking about it. So I'll be quiet now.
Well, now we know.
Yeah.
But no, I think those are excellent examples, Professor. And I think crisis definitely is sometimes the mother of invention. And I really hope that given the climate crisis that we are all approaching, we can preempt and be able to invent before, and we don't wait for that to happen. The example you gave about pricing, I think that's so relevant to even countries like India, where because of subsidization, groundwater is getting depleted really fast in states like Punjab and Haryana. Now, if we can make and subsidize treated water and price it lower than the fresh water, I think that's an excellent replicable differential pricing could be a very replicable solution in other parts of the world as well, including India. But a very quick follow-up. What are your thoughts on, the very controversial seed clouding or the future of lab-grown food, or genetically modified crops? Where do you see these technologies going, and do you think they can have a positive impact on these challenges that we face?
Yeah, seed clouding, cloud seeding. Sorry, it's really they give it too much of a big thing. For example, some people attributed the flooding in Dubai to that. It's not correct at all. It's actually seeding clouds. Essentially, you have to have the clouds first. You have to have the moisture. So essentially, what you do when you're capturing whatever in the water. But if there is nothing, you cannot get anything. So really, I don't believe it is going to be very substantial. What's happening for the United Arab Emirates, one of the things that are happening, not related to cloud seeding, but it relates to climatic changes. Interestingly, what's happening to this region of the world, there will be more water actually. There's going to be more rain. We start to see it. There's a shift in climate system, so they're going to bring. So what? We're going to see more rain, more these extreme events. That's one thing is going to happen. So we're going to get more water, but in the form of more. So that's happening. Now, back to the lab grown. And I think there was, in the region here, there was a fatwa about it because many people will not eat it because it's not, whether it's halal or not. They came out of both from Saudi Arabia and from other Arab countries regarding Islamic countries that it's okay to eat cultured meat as long as it is slaughtered in a halal way. Okay. As long as the culture of the thing. So there is, this is very important. Otherwise, people are not going to eat it. It's not cheap, by the way. Still, it's not cheap to do. And it will be, how many in the audience will eat a burger from a cultured meat? No, you don't have, yeah. But I remember seeing a documentary on this, and many people will not eat it. It's a psychological thing. It's just, it doesn't mean it's harmful. So there is a very important part. If you're gonna get, so right now still, it is an important aspect, but I believe it has a long way to go to really deal with this. One thing we need to remember, eating meat is very expensive to the water and also the climate. Believe it or not, most of the food we grow worldwide, almost 80% goes to feed livestock. Only 20% direct, vegetables to eat or greens and all that. So really, we need to shift to have less meat diet. So that's another thing about food security. You need to encourage people to adopt a more balanced, less meat. It's good for the health. It's good for the environment. It's good for security. It's another aspect of that. So I think both these things are just growing, but I don't believe they are going to have a huge impact in the region. Not yet.
Though in many parts of the world, especially in the West, the investments in mock meat has actually really increased over the years. It's one of the biggest, more prominent areas of investment today.
You raised another issue, sorry, because I want to capture before we leave it. Very important for the region is what we call the groundwater. Groundwater, most of the groundwater in this region is what we call fossil groundwater, meaning it's not renewable. These are waters which accumulated over thousands of years when this region, I'm talking about the whole Middle East, was much wetter. So essentially like oil. And unfortunately, a lot of that water has already been extracted. And we see huge drops. So really that water is very precious because it is high quality. So we call it fossil groundwater. So this is the reason. I think India has faced similar problems in some regions near the Punjab and also Rajasthan and others. Yeah, so they have similar problem, but it is a big problem in the Middle East here.
Great.
Yeah.
So Salman, coming to you, and we'll then open it up to the audience. Can you talk us through what are the technological, solutions to water and food security out there? Are there certain technologies that you have witnessed or played with that you think there is a lot of that hold a lot of promise? And so, yeah, coming from a technical, from a tech background, what are your thoughts on this?
So, like you mentioned, right? Necessity is actually the mother of invention, and when you feel the need to actually invent something that's going to benefit or that you see is going to be a game changer for the society, you tend to adopt it or you tend to innovate more on it, right? And we do see a lot of technology coming in the space of vertical farming, hydroponics, right? Essentially using tech to grow crops more efficiently, utilize water more efficiently, to do planning in terms of realizing beforehand what's the need, doing the right demand planning to understand what to grow, where to grow, right? Using technology that's home built or locally grown in order to sort of optimize the whole supply chain. I think that's a big thing now. In fact, one of the biggest, I come from a startup background, so one of the biggest startups in the UAE is Pure Harvest Farms, right? And it was one of the first unicorns to come out of the region. And Pure Harvest Farms is what it does vertical farming, and it does agricultural tech, right? Agri-tech as we call it. And they've recently started Ocean Harvest, in which goes on seafood tech and looking at fish life and all of that, right? Pisciculture as we call it. But yeah, there's a lot of innovation happening in tech. I think there still needs to be slight focus change on utilizing the tech rightfully for creating an impact. The region is moving towards that. There are funds which are coming up to sort of further the cause. There are accelerators, there are government initiatives coming up, right? We recently were a part of one of the earlier thought leadership sessions that was conducted by MAN, which is a part of Abu Dhabi government, right? And they are specifically focused on pushing companies or initiatives that focus on social and environmental impact. But I think coming back to the tech angle, things like AI, which we hear every day, right? So using AI to do the rightful demand generation, planning across last mile logistics, production, utilization of water, all of that is going to become very essential, and I think it needs to be driven by the government in the region or in order to push the corporates to do it. Also by the educators to push the newer generation to think more about it. But one thing that I'd like to close on is, I think especially this region, it all till a very recent timeline, we were all more towards making Dubai or making UAE the destination for the world. So it was a lot dependent on optics, right? Everything had to be available all the time. So in places like India, where we come from, where water is much more abundant, we still had rationed water through growing up, right? We had water coming in 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening, and we'd fill buckets. Even though I think it was more of a logistics problem there rather than the availability of water. And then you land in a place like UAE where you don't even think twice before using plastic bottles and drinking it half and then throwing it away, because everything is in abundance, right? And that's where I feel that apart from the tech being the driver, there has to be a mindset and a behavioral shift for the consumers, for the whole region to think about how we consume. We are becoming a consumer driven economy. Like US is consumer driven. The eastern part of the world like India and India is services driven. UAE is also becoming a consumer driven economy, and I think the rightful consumption of the resources we have is going to actually reduce a lot of the stress on the food and water ecosystem, which is already a big problem for everyone, right? So tech can come in to help, but as long as people don't adopt the tech or take the problem seriously or think of making the world a better place, it's not going to help at all.
Right. So, firstly, to be clear, we're using glass bottles here. So, just want to clarify that. And I think as long as we have, innovators like you and Wahid and professors like Dr. Samara and Dr. Asaf here, I think we're in good hands. I'm going to open this up to the audience. Please, firstly, introduce yourself with a name and your affiliation, and please pose your questions to the panel. And if you have any specific question for a specific speaker, please do specify that as well. Right. So maybe we'll take those three for now. So shared risks, behavioral mindset, and role of education policy. Any updates or progress there? And of course, the I2U2 food security and food transport corridors. So should we go?
I'll speak about the treated wastewater issue. The way I would think about it, and it's happening gradually, you go with the low-hanging fruit, meaning, and it's happening here, for example, United Arab Emirates. You start with not agriculture, with landscaping. So right now, the government is still thinking about using it for food production. So treated wastewater, you start with the low-hanging fruit, meaning I use it for places where I don't grow food. And that's right now is happening already in the United Arab Emirates. The second tier, if you want to think about it, is to grow food, but there are different types of food. If you have a tree versus you have what they call crops, where they have to touch. So that's another aspect. So right now, we are at that stage here in the United Arab Emirates. In other countries, like say Jordan, Tunisia, and others, they're already producing food. But it's very important to remember, the level of treatment matters, and you need to tell people why it is. Meaning that is it primary, secondary, tertiary? So from a technical point of view, secondary and tertiary are acceptable for agriculture. If you start to go beyond that, which is actually drinking water, it's happening in some countries. The way it is, it's like almost you are tricking people. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Many experiments in the US, for example, they have in two places in the world now, in Singapore and Orange country in Los Angeles, that they use treated wastewater to the level you can drink it. But how many would do that when you see a stream of wastewater raw, and then at the end there is a cup, you drink it? Not many people will do that. So what's happening instead? You break that cycle, you treat the wastewater, you pump it into groundwater, and several months or maybe a year, it come out as a groundwater. People will be happy with it. They will use it. They will drink from it. So the thing is, it is a way you gradually. So as I mentioned, Tunisia, Jordan, it's already happening. It's related to what they call it really necessity. As I mentioned, farmers prefer to use fresh water. They don't want treated water. But they have to use treated water, they use it. If you go back in time, almost 100 years ago, in the United States, they use raw sewage for agriculture. They didn't know about it. They didn't know about the damage to the health until there was a typhoid epidemic in the US, and they realized the danger of using raw sewage for agriculture. So the thing is, it's already happening. Not much about it in education. I teach, I talk about it in let's say, university, but I don't see it yet at the level of schools and so on. That's not happening yet. But I see progression. Another aspect for treated wastewater is infrastructure, meaning you need to bring the water from the place where you generate the treated wastewater to the place where they use it. So if I have, and now this is happening again, a lot of reasons why they don't use treated wastewater, because you produce it. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to transport it? So that's another aspect that needs to go along with the ability to use treated wastewater.
Got it. Yes, Professor.
So I wanted to answer a little bit of what we can do in terms of education. There is a lot of awareness, more awareness on education. We do have an environmental day at AUS, and we do get younger and younger generations that are a little bit more conscious. I think if we think about it with social media, it seems like the population, the younger population, is being more conscious. So when we talk about the idea, and I think you mentioned this about the consumers, we need to start building these generations that are going to understand the challenges and that are going to understand that they have to be part of the change. So I don't think that we need to put that pressure always on the government or on industries, but the general public needs to also put some of that or bear some of that. What we can do, there are so many initiatives in the UAE, in the region, but can we find a platform to put all those initiatives together to really have a conversation between what everybody's doing and see how we can join the efforts? Because I feel like we're wasting a lot of our efforts by individualizing. I'm doing something in my lab, but maybe somebody else is doing the similar effort somewhere else and we can work together. So there has to be a lot more coordination in order to be able to, so platforms like this in which we can, I mean, I didn't know the work that he did, and it seems like we have a lot of things in common. So maybe put in those platforms that we can work together, and we're all busy and everybody wants to progress, but how can we just join efforts to be able to do so? That's one of the really important. And you touch upon something really important, and I think it is the idea that we need to work with what we have. So when we talk about water, I mean, here they've been using a lot of the wastewater for irrigation in certain areas, but Singapore, as I mentioned before, Singapore is doing a really beautiful way of creating awareness. They have a center, they bring people in, look at the water that it is wastewater reuse, and it is fine. They show them the process, and that creates that awareness. So I think that we can say a lot about knowledge and imparting that knowledge, but we also need to understand that we need to create that awareness. And certainly I love how you said that educators need to really incorporate the whole idea of AI, because myself, my research has changed so much in the last 10 years when I realized that just getting data out there without really using AI to understand that data and to show how we can predict models, right, is worthless. So I think we need to really combine all those efforts. And certainly that's one of the things I tell my students, that you need to get into it. You need to get into understanding how I give you numbers, but what can you do with those numbers?
To address a point that our colleague from RSDI mentioned, what can we do after this lovely talk? It's a great panel discussion. We shared lovely ideas. We'll have some nice canopies and drinks and water after this talk. But what happens after that? Yeah. Our organization and ORF are working on this summit that we are putting together, and there will be a series of roundtables. I believe a critical step to unlock some of that dry powder, the funds that are available by larger private equity funds today that want to deploy that money, is again catalytic funding, is technical assistance facilities to reduce the risk of a lot of these projects, so that this deal pipeline can be filled with a lot of these projects, right? There are a lot of great projects out there, but they simply have a lot of inherent embedded risks in them. So how can we sit down in these roundtable formats with the right banks, financial institutions, sovereign wealth funds, and of course institutions like RSDI, to see how can these facilities be structured? What is the demand side from the project developers? What is the demand from the private equity investors? What risks they want to eliminate? And then how can these facilities be created? I think that's a tangible step, but I'm being very wishful.
But that's an excellent plug. Wahid, thank you for doing that on our behalf. I can't, but I'm glad you did. So I appreciate that.
I have one point on Dr. Wan's question, right? So, and this we see very often, that if you break this panel down and the people in the room into three major entities, it is your researchers, your government and policy makers, and people who are implementers or operationally involved in the problem, right? And we often see that all three are working in isolation. There's not enough knowledge sharing both ways. Usually the flow of knowledge is from one entity to the other, so all decisions being taken are only taken not keeping in mind the third party. So there's some great research being done by academicians to understand what needs to be addressed and what is critical in nature today. A lot of the times the policymakers don't take note of it. The policies are being driven more with relation to what they feel is right, and I think it needs to also you also need to take into account people who are on ground, right? You can do all the research, you can make all the policies, but if there's no one to implement it or no one who can give you perspective on whether this can be done or not, it's no offense to any consultant in the room, but it's going to be like a consulting project, right? You spend millions of dollars and you get a pitch deck, and then you say, okay, this is how we will solve the problem, but nobody goes ahead and solves the problem at all, because the people who are solving the problem don't are not doing it because of policy, right? They're doing it because they feel that the problem is critical enough or is financially viable enough to be solved. Also, one small point that I'd like to add is a lot catalytic funding is what you mentioned a couple of times, right? I think that's what needs. So I think funding needs to be available in much smaller pockets also, because a lot of the innovators do not have access to funds to be able to get or operationalize what they want to build, right? And that I feel is uh, is a reason why the world is not moving fast enough towards innovation, because a lot of the people who are actually able to execute or build tech are all who have access to the finances. So the finances need to be available to in much smaller tickets and much smaller sort of entities, so that you can quickly test what can be executed and then bring in the big players to sort of push the agenda or operationalize of and make utilize the research that is being done and drive policy that needs to be implemented, right?
Right. So while scale is important, I think agility and nimbleness is also extremely crucial. I think this is the point you're making. Very briefly on a point on I2U2 or the IMEC, I think at this point, while there is a lot of interest in all the governments to be able to push for this, the whole geopolitics of the situation is somehow, in some sense, prioritizing other aspects, which is security cooperation, even physical infrastructure cooperation to be able to facilitate greater energy and food and other aspects of cooperation. So I think there isn't enough that's happening. I think if you're talking about progress, there's a lot more that needs to be done. And unfortunately, there are other aspects which have sort of taken prominence and are dominating the discourse. The intent is there in our understanding among all the government and among the parties involved. I think we need to push. And one of the things we are working at ORF is also that how do we ring fence a lot of the agendas, like the climate agenda, like the green transition agenda, like the food and water security agenda, from geopolitical upheavals, and utilize these minilaterals to be able to ring fence and enforce some of the work that they were set up to do, which is beyond security, to look at more economic cooperation and strategic cooperation. So I think we'll end it with that. Thank you so much to this excellent panel for their thoughts and time. And thank you all for coming in and listening and asking questions. It's been extremely insightful. And I'll also end by saying that this is just one of the sessions that we're doing. We do hope to do a series of panels and roundtables and discussions. And we hope you all will join us and make it as collaborative and interactive as this was today. So thank you. And thank you to RSDI once again.